The day her father came home with that look on his face, the one he only wore when the debt collectors had been by again, Ivy Callender knew her life was about to change in a way she couldn't undo. She was 22 years old, standing at the kitchen stove with flour on her hands and a pot of thin soup doing its best on a low flame. The house smelled like damp wood and worry. It had smelled that way for 2 years, ever since her mother passed and her father started making decisions with a bottle instead of his head. He sat down at the table without taking off his hat. That was always the tell. "There's a man," he said. "Name of Garrett Lowe. He's agreed to settle what I owe." Ivy set down the spoon. "What does that mean?" Her father looked at the table. "It means he'll take the debt, the land note, everything, clear it all, on one condition." She already knew. Somehow, she already knew. But she asked anyway, because some part of her needed to hear him say it out loud, needed to watch him look her in the eye when he did. He couldn't. He looked at the window instead. "He wants a wife," he said. "He's been out at the Redstone claim for going on 6 years. No family, nobody. He came into town last week for supplies and apparently spoke to Burke at the bank about the situation and— Papa. Ivy, we lose the land by Friday if something don't change. You want me to marry a stranger to pay off your gambling debts." The word gambling landed like a slap. He flinched. She let him. The silence that followed was the longest of her life. Outside, a horse went by on the dirt road. A dog barked twice and quit. The soup bubbled quietly like it didn't know anything had just broken. "I don't have another way," he said, and his voice cracked on the last word, and she hated him a little for that. Hated him for having the audacity to sound like the wounded one. She thought about her options that night, lying on her back in the dark, staring at the ceiling with her hands folded over her chest like a body already laid out. She had $12 saved in a tin beneath the floorboard. She had no relatives worth mentioning. She had a half-finished piece of embroidery on the table and a library book 3 weeks overdue, and a life so small she could hold the whole of it in 2 cupped hands. In the morning she told her father yes. She told herself it was practical. She told herself plenty of marriages started with less. She told herself all the things a person tells themselves when they are walking toward a door they can't see behind. She met Garrett Lowe on a Tuesday. He came to the house to sign the papers, and she stood in the doorway and got her first look at the man she was going to marry. He was tall, broader through the shoulders than she'd expected, with dark hair that had gone longer than was fashionable, and a beard that suggested he hadn't been to town in a good while before last week. His clothes were clean but worn. Canvas trousers, a heavy coat with a frayed cuff, boots that had seen serious country. His hands, when he signed his name, were the hands of a man who worked with them constantly, calloused and scarred and large. He didn't smile at her. He didn't try to make conversation. He signed where the lawyer pointed, shook her father's hand once, and then looked at Ivy for the first time directly and said, "We'll leave Thursday morning. Pack for cold." That was all. She spent Wednesday sitting with what she'd agreed to. Thursday she packed her trunk. The wagon ride out of town was the quietest 2 hours of her life. Garrett drove. Ivy sat beside him with her hands in her lap and watched the town she'd grown up in disappear behind a rise of brown hills. She'd been born in that town. Her mother was buried in its churchyard. She hadn't said goodbye to anyone except her father, and even that had felt like a formality. 2 people going through the motions of tenderness they'd stopped feeling for each other somewhere in the last 2 years. She tried to make conversation once, around the first hour. "How far is the claim?" "About 4 more hours." "What do you farm?" "I don't farm." She waited for more. Nothing came. "Then what do you?" "Timber. Some trapping. We'll talk when we get there." She turned back to the road and didn't try again. The country they drove through was harder and more beautiful than anything within 20 miles of her town. The hills built themselves up into something serious, dark with pine, striped with the pale ribbons of creek beds running low in the autumn dry. The air changed, got colder, sharper, carrying a smell she didn't have a word for, something ancient and mineral and clean. She found herself sitting up straighter despite herself. The road got narrower. Then it got worse. Then it was barely a road at all, just wheel ruts pressed into clay, winding up through the trees in a way that suggested no one came this way who didn't already know where they were going. Ivy thought, "This is where I'm going to live." She thought, "Nobody would even know where to look for me." She pressed her hands flat against her thighs and watched the trees close in on either side and breathed. They arrived at what she assumed was their destination, as the light was going golden low. There was a cabin, she used the word generously, set back from a clearing, backed against a granite outcrop like it was trying to disappear into the rock. It was small, one room that she could see, a covered porch, a woodpile stacked head-high running the full length of the south wall, a lean-to for the horse, a well, smoke from the chimney, which meant someone had been there recently to bank the fire, though she saw no one. She sat in the wagon and looked at it. Garrett climbed down and began unhitching the horse without looking at her. "Is there?" she started. "Inside's clean," he said. "There's a second room through the back wall. It was a storage room. It's yours. I put a latch on the inside yesterday." She absorbed this. He'd put a latch on her door before she'd arrived. He'd thought of it without being asked. She climbed down herself because clearly no one was going to help her do it, and carried her own trunk inside. The cabin was, as promised, clean. Sparse to the point of austerity. A table, 2 chairs, a stone fireplace doing serious work against the cold, a single shelf of books above it, a kitchen area that was functional and nothing more. The floor was bare wood, swept. There were no curtains, no rugs, no decoration of any kind, nothing that suggested a woman had ever been here, nothing that suggested anyone had ever tried to make it a home. The back room was small enough that the trunk would take up most of the floor space. There was a cot, a wool blanket, a small window that looked at the rock face 3 feet away, and there, on the inside of the door, was the latch. New iron, set carefully. She sat on the edge of the cot for a long time. Dinner that night was silent. He cooked salt pork and hard biscuits, and set a plate in front of her and sat across from her and ate. She ate. Outside, the wind had picked up and was doing things to the trees that made them sound like something alive and unhappy. She asked because she had to ask eventually, "Are you going to tell me anything about yourself?" He looked up from his plate. "What do you want to know?" "Anything. Something. We're married. I don't know your middle name. I don't know how old you are. I don't know why you wanted a wife or why you chose." She stopped herself. "Why you chose someone else's problem. Why you approached my father." 41, he said. "My middle name's Francis, which I'd prefer you didn't spread around. And I didn't choose your father Burke. At the bank mentioned you specifically. Said you were smart and capable and had been running your family's household alone for 2 years. I needed someone competent, not someone ornamental." It was the most he'd said at once. She had no idea what to do with it. "That's a practical reason to marry someone," she said finally. "I'm a practical man." "So I've noticed." Something moved in his expression, not quite a smile. The ghost of one, maybe. He cleared the plates and went to bed, and she sat by the fire alone for an hour, and for the first time since Tuesday, she let herself actually feel what she'd been holding at arm's length, and it turned out to be something heavier than she'd expected. She didn't cry. She'd decided on the wagon that she was done crying over things she'd already chosen. The days that followed had a structure to them. That was, whatever else it was, at least reliable. Garrett was up before light, gone by the time she came out of her room, back by midday for a meal, gone again until dark. He left her to manage the cabin, which she did, because managing was what she knew how to do, and because it was better than sitting still with her own thoughts. She found that he had, in fact, read most of the books on that shelf. She found that he had a system for everything, the woodpile organized by size, the tools hung in a specific order on the lean-to wall, the pantry stocked with a precision that suggested long experience of isolation. She didn't disrupt any of it. She added to it. He noticed. She could tell by the way he paused sometimes, looking at something she'd done. The mended saddlebag hung back in its place, the canned goods rearranged so the older ones sat forward, and then moved on without comment. She had learned by the second week that his silence was not the same as indifference. It was the middle of October when the first snow came. It came fast and serious, the way it apparently came in that country. Not the polite announcement of a Virginia winter, but a full declaration. Overnight, that summer was a thing of the past and would not be negotiated with. She woke up, and the world outside the window was white, and the temperature inside the cabin had dropped significantly, and when she came out, Garrett was already at the fireplace adding wood, and without turning around he said, "There's a second pair of wool socks on the table. They'll be too big, but they'll do." She stood in the doorway of her little room and looked at the socks. He had not forgotten that she had come from a warmer valley. He had thought, ahead of time, about her feet. She sat down and put on the socks. They were enormous. She said nothing. He said nothing. The fire rebuilt itself into something serious, and the snow kept coming. She asked him that evening, because the snow had locked them in together, and the silence felt less sustainable with nowhere to go. "Why do you live out here, like this, away from everything?" It was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "I had a different life for a while," he said. "Down south. Business. More than I needed of most things." He looked at the fire. "Turns out that's not the same as having what you actually want." "What did you want?" He looked up at her. The firelight did something to his eyes that she didn't look at too long. "Quiet," he said. "Something real. Someone who wasn't there for what I could give them." She let that sit for a moment. "That's why you came out here looking like you couldn't afford a new coat," she said. He almost laughed. She heard it die in his throat before it made it out. "Something like that," he said. She thought about what he'd said for days afterward. She turned it over the way you turn over a stone when you think there might be something interesting underneath, carefully, prepared for either possibility. She had assumed, from the first moment she'd seen him, that she was looking at the sum total of the man. Rough coat, rough hands, 2-hour silences, a cabin with no curtains. She had filed him away as simple and austere and entirely without mystery, because that was easier than curiosity, and curiosity felt dangerous when you were already in a situation you couldn't leave. But the books nagged at her. She'd looked closer. Not paperback dime novels, but serious books. Philosophy, engineering, a surveying manual with handwritten notes in the margins. Handwriting that was precise and educated and nothing like what you'd expect from a man who lived in a timber claim in the mountains. And she'd found something else by accident, a month in. She'd been looking for a hammer in the lean-to and moved a cupboard crate she'd assumed held hardware and found it held papers. Land documents, survey maps, pages of figures that she'd understood immediately because her father had showed her enough debt paperwork in the last 2 years that numbers like that were legible to her. There were a lot of zeros. She put the crate back exactly as she'd found it and went back inside and sat down at the table and stared at the wall for a while. She thought, "Who is this man?" She didn't say anything. She waited. She had learned in the weeks since she'd arrived that pushing Garrett Lowe produced nothing, that he revealed things on his own schedule and on no other. November came. The snow was permanent now, the world reduced to the clearing and the tree line and the small fierce circle of warmth that the cabin generated against the cold. She had stopped thinking about the town she'd come from except occasionally and with a strange detachment like remembering a dream. She had started to think instead about Garrett, not the way she would have preferred not to, not in the way that complicated things, but she found herself noticing him with a frequency and a specificity that was new, the way he moved in the lean-to without wasted motion, the way he read, sitting by the fire, completely elsewhere and completely still, the way he'd once, without comment, come inside and found her with a migraine that had put her flat on the table with her head on her arms, and had made some kind of tea she didn't ask him about, and set it in front of her, and gone back outside. She thought about that tea longer than was sensible. The question finally came out in December, because the winter had stripped most of the unnecessary things away, and she was tired of carrying it. "Garrett," she said one evening, "what is in that crate in the lean-to?" He was reading. He closed the book slowly, keeping his finger on the page, which somehow felt significant. He didn't put it down, which meant either the question didn't warrant his full attention, or he needed to think. "Records," he said. "I know. I looked. I wasn't snooping. I was looking for a hammer, and it shifted. I didn't go through anything." She paused. "But I read numbers well, and there were a lot of them." He looked at her. "The timber operation isn't the whole picture," he said carefully. "I understand that. Ivy," he set the book down. "I'll tell you. I was going to tell you when the winter settled in and we had time to talk properly. Not as a confession. Nothing hidden was ever meant to harm you. I just needed—" He stopped, and something crossed his face that she hadn't seen before, something careful and uncertain, which was so different from every expression she'd seen from him that she paid close attention. "I needed to know who you were first, before I showed you what you'd married into. I didn't want it to be a factor." "What do you mean?" "Come with me," he said. He got up, put on his coat, took the lantern. She followed him out into the snow. They went past the lean-to, past the back of the cabin, into the trees on the east side of the clearing, along a path she hadn't known was there, packed down with use that predated her arrival by years. The cold was serious and deep, and the snow on the branches above them caught the lantern light and threw it back. She walked in his boot prints, because the snow was thigh-high on either side of the track. After 20 minutes, she started to see something through the trees. Light, not cold starlight, but warm gold light, several sources. And then the trees gave way. She stopped walking. Before her, set into a natural bowl in the mountain that had been invisible from the cabin, and invisible, she realized, from any road she'd ever traveled, was a house. More than a house. A structure of timber and stone, 3 stories, generous and solid and beautifully made, every window lit against the dark. A wide covered porch. Smoke from 2 chimneys. Outbuildings she could make out beyond the lamplight. It sat in the snow like it had grown there, like the mountain had decided to make it, and it was warm with light in the way that only a lived-in place can be warm. Ivy stood in the snow and could not speak. "I built it 8 years ago," Garrett said. He was watching her, not the house. "Took 2 years. I brought the craftsmen in from Portland, paid them well to stay quiet. The mountain does the rest. The bowl catches it from view. No one down in the valley has ever seen it." He paused. "I come out here every evening. This is where I actually live." She turned and looked at him. "The cabin," she said, "is what I show the world, yes." She looked back at the house. Her mind was doing something complicated, taking in the contrast, the sheer scale of what had been 200 yards away from her every single day for 3 months, hidden so completely that she'd never had a suspicion. "You let me live in a one-room cabin," she said slowly, "when this was—" "I needed to know," he said again, and there was something raw in his voice now, something she hadn't heard from him before. "You didn't choose me, Ivy. You were put in a situation and you made the best of it. I understand that, but I needed to see who you were when you thought there was nothing, when you thought this was all there was. Whether you'd be cruel or petty, or whether you'd—" He stopped. "Whether you'd just make it work. Because of who you are, not because of what I had." She was quiet for a long time. "And," she said. "You mended my saddlebag," he said. "You reorganized the pantry. You read every book on that shelf. You put on socks that were 4 sizes too big and didn't complain. You asked me who I was and actually listened to the answer." He looked at her carefully. "You passed something. I don't know what else to call it." The wind moved through the trees. Somewhere an owl said its piece. Ivy looked at the house and then at the man beside her, and then at her own hands in their too thin gloves, and thought about everything she'd carried since the night her father sat down with his hat still on and wouldn't meet her eyes. "I want to see it," she said. "The whole thing." He gestured toward the door. "It's yours," he said simply. "As much as it's mine. Everything in that crate, the land, the records. You should know what you married into, not because it changes anything, but because you have the right to know what's yours." She walked toward the house through the snow. When she stepped onto the porch and he opened the door for her, the warmth that came out was enormous. Real warmth. A fireplace built for a room that deserved it. Wooden floors that glowed. Walls hung with maps and surveying tools. And here and there, something purely beautiful. A piece of colored glass. A carefully framed sketch of the mountain as seen from the valley. A kitchen that was real. A table long enough to seat 8. A staircase that curved up and out of sight. She walked slowly through the first floor and didn't speak. He didn't follow too close, gave her the room to look without feeling watched. She ran her hand along the back of a chair. She looked out the window at the snow coming down in the lamplight. She thought about what he'd said, whether you'd just make it work, because of who you are. She thought about her father at the table, unable to look at her. She thought about the girl who'd packed a trunk in a single afternoon, and told herself it was practical. It was practical, and it was also, she thought now, something else. It was the act of someone who knew how to survive and had decided that surviving was enough to ask for. She hadn't thought to ask for anything more, not safety, not tenderness, not to be seen. And here, in the warm light of a house she hadn't known existed 3 months ago, with a man who had looked at her running a bare-bones cabin in the cold and decided she was worth the truth, she felt something move in her chest. Not love, not yet, but the precondition of it, the open door. She turned around. Garrett was standing in the entrance to the kitchen, leaning one shoulder against the frame, watching her with an expression she couldn't name but recognized. It was the expression of someone waiting to be told whether or not they've done an irreparable thing. "You could have just told me," she said. "I know. You were testing me." "Yes." She considered this. "I don't love that," she said. "I know that too." He was quiet. "I'm sorry. For the cabin. For the months of it. I won't ask you to think it was fair because it wasn't." She looked at him for a long moment. "The socks," she said finally. "The tea when I had the headache. Those weren't tests. Those were just." "No," he said. "Those were just, yes." She nodded slowly. She looked around the room again, the light, the warmth, the extraordinary fact of it. And then she did something she hadn't done since the day they met. She crossed the floor toward him and stopped an arm's length away and held out her hand. Not a handshake, not a performance, just the offering of it, the open palm. He looked at it for a moment like a man who had read a surveying manual his whole life and never once encountered this particular terrain. Then he took it. His hand was warm and calloused and certain, and he held hers the way you hold something you don't intend to let the cold get at. Outside, the snow kept falling over the mountain and the valley and the road and the little cabin in the clearing that had never been the whole story. Inside, 2 people who had each, in their own way, stopped believing in more than survival, stood together in a room full of warm light and quietly reconsidered. "I keep thinking about the socks. That's the detail that stays with me, not the house, not the reveal, not the moment Ivy walked through that door and found warmth she hadn't known to ask for. It's the wool socks Garrett left on the table before the first snow, because he'd thought ahead about her feet. Nobody asked him to do that. There was no audience for it. It was just a quiet, decent thing done by a man who decided privately that her comfort mattered. That's what integrity actually looks like, I think. Not the grand gesture, not the confession in the firelight, the socks on the table before the storm. Ivy didn't come into this story with much. A tin with $12 in it. A father who couldn't look her in the eye when he handed her life away. She made a choice that wasn't really a choice. And then she did something I find genuinely remarkable. She didn't let the bitterness of it make her smaller. She reorganized the pantry. She read every book on the shelf. She mended things that weren't hers to begin with. Not because anyone was watching. Not because she expected a reward. Because that's who she was when there was nothing to perform for. That's the thing about character. It doesn't show up when conditions are good. It shows up in a one-room cabin in November when you think this is all there is. And Ivy's showed up every single day. Garrett saw it. That was his intelligence at work. Not cleverness, not calculation, but the real kind of knowing. Understanding that you can't learn who someone is from what they say about themselves, only from what they do when they think it doesn't matter. He built a beautiful house and kept it hidden, not out of cruelty, but out of a hard-earned understanding that wealth reveals nothing true about a person. It only reveals what people want from wealth, so he stripped it away and watched. Was the test fair? No. Ivy herself said so, and she was right. But I understand the wound behind it. He'd had the bells and the whistles before, the life that looked like everything, and learned what it actually was. When you've been chosen for your wallet enough times, you start to need to know, really know. What I take from that is this: wisdom earned through loss is still wisdom, and the willingness to be honest about what you need, even when the method of finding it is imperfect, is something. The part that moves me most is Ivy's final choice. She crossed the floor and held out her hand, not because he'd earned it cleanly, not because the situation was perfect or the math worked out, but because she looked at a man who had thought about her feet before the snow came and decided that was worth something. That took a particular kind of courage, the kind that doesn't announce itself, doesn't wait for perfect conditions, just takes the step while the door is still open. There's a version of this story where she walks back through the snow alone, $12 in a trunk, because she's too proud or too hurt to trust again. I understand that version, but I think the version where she reaches out her hand is harder to arrive at and more honest about what it actually takes to build a life alongside another person. You don't get there without character. You don't get there without the willingness to keep thinking clearly when emotion is doing its best to close everything down. And you don't get there without the endurance to survive the cabin before anyone shows you the house. Ivy had all three. That's why she got to walk through the door.